Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 21, Section 2, Early Battles. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the early battles for the United States primarily. All right, so if you look at your main idea here, the Japanese continued to win victories in the Pacific until the Battle of Midway. When we look at the Battle of Pearl Harbor or the attack on Pearl Harbor, this is a well orchestrated event because not only were there attacks on Pearl Harbor, but there were attacks on other parts of Asia basically within that same time frame. And so you can look at Indochina, you can look at the Philippines, and literally within a few hours after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were attacking American airfields on the Philippines. And at this period of time, the Philippines were, for the most part, under the military leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. And as the Japanese kept encroaching upon that nation, they get pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula. And it's at that point in time President Roosevelt informs Douglas MacArthur that he needs to leave because psychologically it would be awful if our top general gets captured by the Japanese. And so he is ordered to go to Australia. But unfortunately, he has to leave his men and personnel behind. And what ends up happening is over a period of several months, American troops are overwhelmed by Japanese forces. Okay. When the American forces defending the Bataan Peninsula surrendered in April of 1942, nearly 78,000 of them were forced to march to Japanese prisoner of war camps. And this incident became known as the Bataan Death March because of the fact that when the American soldiers and really even Filipinos who were part of their National Guard and civilians alike, if a soldier would help a fellow soldier who was kind of falling behind, the Japanese would single them out and, for the most part, would punish them, if not kill them, for helping a fellow soldier. Which, if you learn anything in basic training, that's one of the things that you kind of get hammered into you, and that's that you never leave a soldier behind. And this is what the Japanese are trying to break the Americans of. And so those people who did survive the march obviously had been brutalized, but were yet the treatment in the prisoner of war camps was totally inhumane. So definitely a lot of hardships are going to be felt there by those American prisoners of war uh, being held by the Japanese. In the early part of 1942, our president wanted to kind of get a strike back at the Japanese. And so he asked one of his commanders, General Jimmy Doolittle, who was part of the Army Air Corps, to see if he could arrange for some type of attack that could be placed on the Japanese homeland. And what Doolittle did is he figured out a way that they could take some of the bigger aircraft that we had at the time and to launch them from aircraft carriers. This is one of these joint operations between the U.S. Army and the Navy, which, by the way, is kind of an unheard of thing when we think about our military branches getting along and working together. But Doolittle's men, they did a lot of training down in the panhandle of Florida, and eventually they take off to sea in around February of 1942. And after this Doolittle raid, just so you know, the naval carrier that these aircraft were being carried on had actually come in contact with a civilian Japanese fishing boat, and not wanting to give up this operation, it was decided that they would go ahead and launch the aircraft probably a little bit sooner than they had hoped. And there were a lot of concerns because if you were launching too soon, would you have enough fuel and such? The goal was is that these aircraft were not going to land back on the carrier. They were just going to take off from that, and that the planes that they were using would eventually be delivered to China to help the nationalist forces kind of defend themselves against the Japanese troops that were basically in China. So as things go on, many of the planes, for the most part, make it to Japan. They drop their bombs. Okay, it's a success in that regard. But as they're leaving Japan, heading towards the mainland coast of China, this is where we get into some complications because a lot of these planes are running out of fuel. And needless to say, not all the planes made it, but for the most part, it was still considered a success because of the fact that the Japanese were now being hit on their own homeland. So that was kind of a positive is in terms of the military's objectives. Anyway, so after the Doolittle raid, the Japanese decided the American fleet had to be destroyed to protect, for the most part, the nation of Japan and the city of Tokyo from bombing. And so that becomes the big priority of the Japanese Navy. Uh, the goal is to go after the carriers, which, by the way, were not touched during the attack on Pearl Harbor because they were at sea. And so in May of 1942, there is going to be an attack known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is a body of water that's basically to the northeast of the continent of Australia. It's actually very close to where the Great Barrier Reef is. Okay, if that gives you any proximity. But the concern is that the Japanese were looking at taking over the island of New Guinea, which is just to the north of Australia. And strategically, that would be a buffer for Australia if it would be held in the hands of the Allies. So the goal was to keep that from falling to the Japanese. So despite their losses at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American forces prevented the Japanese from cutting the supply lines to Australia. And for the most part, this was successful in that regard. But we did lose a carrier, the USS Lexington, and we had some damage to another carrier, and that was kind of a kind of a sad situation. But a lot of those problems, if you have the right manpower, they can be alleviated very quickly. And so that objective for the Japanese is kind of denied. They had another objective, and actually, this is kind of the brainchild of Admiral Yamamoto, who was one of the guys who was responsible for bringing us that attack at Pearl Harbor. He thought if you wanted to stop the U.S. Navy, you needed to have control of the island of Midway. And Midway is really not much of an island, it's more of an atoll, but it was a refueling station that the Navy had been using for a period of time. And so he was planning an attack on that, unaware that we had broken their code and we knew that's where they were going. And so, unaware that they were heading into an ambush, the Japanese launched their aircraft against Midway on June the 4th, 1942. And what this turns out to be is one of the first all aircraft carrier battles, meaning that the Japanese had their aircraft carriers, we had ours, and it was the airplanes going after the ships. And what ends up happening is we were able to sink a couple of the Japanese carriers. And for the most part, it was kind of a game changer because this is the furthest to the east that the Japanese are going to make it. And everything else is more of a defensive kind of battle, meaning that they're trying to hang on to the territory that they had gained, and they're not necessarily being offensive, trying to gain new territory. So, all in all, that was kind of the turnaround in the battle for the Pacific. Though I will say this, it's going to be a long, hard fought battle. These are just a couple of maps, both the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. I mentioned before the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought just off the coast of Australia, not very far from the island of New Guinea. And certainly we had ships that were sunk. But for the most part, the Japanese weren't able to cut off the shipping. Okay, granted, we're going to have problems here with, obviously submarines attacking Allied ships for the years to come here until the war ends. For the most part, it was considered to be a success. Granted, we're going to be fighting some more battles, battles of the Solomon Islands and eventually Guadalcanal and other places that are going to be really brutal when you talk about the toll it takes on the number of Marines and sailors alike. But for the most part, this is a positive. Okay, the Battle of Midway. I mentioned before, Midway is kind of an atoll. It was like a refueling station for many ships for years, and it's considered to be kind of the closest point next to Hawaii. Granted, it's not that close; it's several hundreds of miles. But needless to say, if you could keep the Japanese away from there, you pretty much could protect the U.S. fleet that was still there at Pearl Harbor. So, by all means, we wanted to make sure that the Japanese don't get a hold of that. All right, your next main idea. The Allies defeated Germany in Africa and in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was a turning point in the war. Stalin, for the most part, he wanted Great Britain and the United States to open up a second front to the war in Europe by attacking Germany from the West to take some pressure off the Soviet Union. Really, what he's calling for is for this, offensive that we're eventually going to fight in 1944, known as D-Day. But this is back in 1942, 1943, and that wasn't quite in the game plan. The goal for Great Britain and the United States was to first get Germany out of North Africa so we could protect shipping lanes in the Mediterranean. You got to remember, Great Britain was getting a lot of its fuel out of the Persian Gulf, and we have our Suez Canal. If the Germans had control of that, certainly that would cut off the British Navy from their fuel sources. So we want to go in there and we want to protect that. And so the British, for the most part, they land troops near basically Alexandria, and they push basically to the west. U.S. eventually we dropped troops in November of 1942 in Morocco, and we're going to drop more troops in parts of Algeria. And eventually we're going to push from the opposite direction. And what we're going to do is try to close in on the Germans. Eventually we're able to do that. What's going to happen is General Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox, he was a tank commander. He's going to fight a series of battles in parts of Tunisia and Algeria. Eventually, it's kind of the writing's kind of on the wall that they're not going to win. And eventually, he's going to be pushed off the continent. But in the meantime, a lot of his troops are going to be taken prisoner. So Egypt was very important to the British because of the Suez Canal. That was one of the most important routes when we talk about the supplying of oil, by all means. Once we push Rommel off the coast of North Africa, we're still going to be fighting. He takes his troops, his presence, basically to Italy, and so we're going to be fighting on the islands of Sicily, eventually pushing from Sicily up the boot heel of Italy by the time we get to about the beginnings of 1944. It's going to be a hard fought battle here. So, the German African Corps, this was commanded by General Erwin Rommel, aka the Desert Fox. He was a tank commander. Matter of fact, he was a guy that even General Patton thought was kind of remarkable for some of his cunning techniques. But needless to say, when you're outnumbered, it makes it really hard to show how clever you are. And for the most part, he's going to be pushed off the continent. What's kind of an interesting side note about Rommel is as we get into like 1944, he's going to be associated with a group of German officers that were supposedly plotting to have Hitler assassinated. And what's going to end up happening is the Gestapo or the SS are going to find out that Rommel's kind of tied to this game, and they're going to basically tell him he has two options. He can either, stand trial and be executed, or he could commit suicide. And he opts to commit suicide to save the name of his family. Because the city of Stalingrad, okay, which is basically in present day Ukraine, it was for the most part on the Volga River and was a major railroad junction. Capturing the city was key to the Germans. And not only that, but because of the locality, it's not very far from the Black Sea, oil is one of those products that's coming through this area. And certainly Hitler was in need of fuel, and being able to kind of capture that certainly would have been a feather in his cap. But unfortunately, his troops are going to get surrounded by the Soviets, and it's going to take a few months of cold weather and brutal fighting that's going to force his troops to surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point in the war, because after that point in time, the Germans are kind of on the defensive. And for the most part, as far as being able to push further to the east, they're being forced to retreat back towards Germany. And eventually, not only are we going to have Stalingrad, but we're going to have Leningrad that's going to fall as well. Thank you very much.